Hello everybody and welcome to the Moose Trail. I'm your host, Chris the Moose Johnson, and we got a very packed episode for you guys today. That is right, we have Will Lewin with his hot hierarchy and breaking down NCAA football. We have Jake Gruel and the Heisman Watch breaking down the top Heisman picks of the week. And we have Kyle Sparrow and Kyle Sparrow's sensational fantasy breakdown. It's going to be a very fun week. We're going to have a lot of information for you guys to go. So, Will, why don't you start us off?
Thank you, Moose, and welcome back, everyone, to the fourth ever edition of the Hot Hierarchy here on the Moose Trail. I'm, of course, your host, Will Lewin, and if you missed it the last 3 weeks, what the Hot Hierarchy is essentially a breakdown of the AP Top 25, putting my own personal college football expertise and, let's be honest, a little bit of bias as well, in order to fix and amend some of the mistakes that the Associated Press are making week in and week out. We've got the college football playoff rankings coming in next week. The College Football Playoff Committee is certainly going to make some mistakes there, but us college football fans are very excited that that is just around the corner. Let's get right into things here on the Hot Hierarchy. We're going to be talking about teams ranked 11th through 25 in the rankings. For the Associated Press, they've got the Clemson Tigers leading the charge, as well as the Iowa State Cyclones at 11. Both of those teams having bye weeks but dropping in the rankings, unfortunately. Then we've got teams like Boise State and Pittsburgh with phenomenal conference wins over the weekend. They move up a couple spots in the rankings. Welcoming back Washington State and Colorado into the AP Top 25, after they blundered for a couple of weeks. And then to round it all off, Illinois and Missouri with some questionable losses there, but they still find themselves in the rankings. Now, going over to the Hot Hierarchy, at number 11 is going to be the BYU Cougars, with Pittsburgh moving up 4 spots to 12, then Alabama right beneath them. Then we've got teams like Texas A&M and Ole Miss moving up a couple spots in the SEC, Boise State, reluctantly, I had to put them in the rankings. It was just too good of a win against our precious UNLV Rebels. And then Louisiana also making an appearance in the Hot Hierarchy Top 25. After we mention them on the block, we'll be talking about them on the block as well this week. And then teams like Missouri, Memphis, and I still have Navy in my rankings before the end of the table for the Hot Hierarchy. Let's talk about some of the scores here. The first one is going to be that Pitt-Syracuse game. And I know what you may be thinking, Will, Pitt had 5 interceptions, 3 of them for pick sixes. What could you possibly say wrong about Pitt? Well, when you look at the statistics here, they had less than 20 minutes of offense the entire game, only 1 trip to the red zone, and went 22% on third down conversions. They're going to be facing a tough SMU team next week, so you'd like to imagine the offense really going to heat things up for the Pittsburgh Panthers. Then moving over to the 16th spot, we see Texas A&M moving up 5. Aggies handle business against LSU at Kyle Field. I mean, I've been saying it for weeks now about LSU after losing to what has been a disappointing USC team, and they had those 2 close wins against South Carolina and Ole Miss. It's been very disappointing for the Tigers, but they're finally out of my rankings once and for all. A&M do travel to South Carolina next weekend, and it could pose some threats for their playoff hopes. We've also got teams like SMU and Boise State. Like I mentioned before, Boise State, Ashton Jeanty not really having his typical Heisman game that we're so used to seeing week in and week out, but they'll be looking to play San Jose State on the road. Not a tough matchup. Again, San Jose State, they did get romped by Fresno State over the weekend, they got romped by 13 points, They had 385 yards with 25 minutes of possession, only 2 trips to the red zone. But when you look at their home stretch, they're scoring 33 points a game, which is 4 points above their average. And then Broncos on the road, they're scoring 12 points less, 14 points less than their average of 44, only around 30 points. So you can definitely think that they're a sleeper. Now, as we talk about Louisiana and Memphis, we are going to get to our On the Block segment here. But before we get to them, we're going to talk about the 2 odd teams out, that being Colorado and Washington State. Firstly, talking about Colorado and Washington State, what they have been up to recently. We talked about it last week, how Washington State are essentially just a designated Mountain West team at this point, and I see no reason why the Cougars shouldn't be winning all of their games by like 40 points. These teams are nothing to be crazy about, especially over the weekend. Not a great win against San Diego State, but they eke out of it by 3 points. I mean, come on. Then we've got Colorado, again, a new Big 12 school, kind of adjusting to the changes, but still doing a good job regardless. because they do have that loss against Kansas State by a score of 31-28. And as we just saw, Kansas State against Kansas over the weekend, not the greatest. The reason why they dropped in the rankings for me, just not a great overall performance in that rivalry in the state of Kansas. Now moving on to the next two teams, we've got Louisiana and Memphis. Again, two teams that I brought up last week. Louisiana, maybe not the greatest wins because they play in such a, watered down conference in the Sun Belt, but wins nonetheless. They are 7-1. They're looking to play Texas State. By the time this episode records, that game will already be done and dusted with. So hopefully that'll be good enough reason for why Louisiana are still in the rankings in the hot hierarchy. And speaking of teams that are still in the hot hierarchy from last week, we're talking about the Memphis Tigers. They're coming off of a very narrow win against Charlotte. A 2-point safety at the end of the game is really what secured the job for the Tigers. But had it not been for that, Charlotte could have easily marched down the field and scored another touchdown in order to win the game. Definitely not what Memphis wants as we go into talk about our next team, which is the Tulane Green Wave. Again, the AAC, or the American Athletic Conference, is really making some big noises here, especially when it comes to the college football playoff. It really is easy to be one of those teams that just kind of eats your way into those bigger championship role games. And Tulane, Memphis, obviously you have Army and Navy really leading the charge in the AAC, trying to make the most of it. Tulane, two kind of huge losses for them against Kansas State and Oklahoma when both of those teams were ranked, but they just recently came back from a road visit against North Texas and the Mean Green down there in the Lone Star State, where they won that game 45-37. But now for the most important part of the day, it's the hot hierarchy top 10, but we're going to go into the AP poll first. Here's who they have at 1, 2, 3, and 4, the same as last week. It's Oregon, Georgia, Penn State, and Ohio State. Following close after is Miami and Texas. They're trading off a couple of spots in the middle of the rankings. They're at 5 and 6. Tennessee, great time to have a bye week. They don't move at all. Nobody jumps them either. But then Notre Dame, BYU, Texas A&M closely following right behind them as they're trying to make some noise in the top 10. Now we move over to the hot hierarchy. Let's see who's on top. I think we already know who it is. It's still going to be the Oregon Ducks, of course. They are looking to bounce back off of that amazing win against Illinois. They're going to be playing Michigan on the road. Definitely not an easy matchup for the Ducks. But right under them, as you see, I've got Penn State jumping over Georgia. We're going to be talking about that in just a minute. But Notre Dame, Miami making up spots in place for Ohio State, who dropped 2 after a abysmal win against Nebraska. I mean, 21 points. Come on now. We've got Indiana moving up 3 spots. They're looking like a very brand new college football team in the Big Ten. Exciting stuff there. Texas, Tennessee, Iowa State, all moving down rankings. Again, just a brutal spot for me personally for Tennessee to get into the top 10. They make room for Indiana. And as we go into a couple of these scores, you can kind of see why I have Penn State jumping Georgia. I talked about it last week on how Penn State just have kind of been the joke of the top 10, just always having teams move around them constantly. But on top of that, their starting quarterback, Drew Allen, left in the first half with a knee injury when they were down 10-7 to the Badgers. Then Bo Perbula came in, handled business against the Badgers, and beat them by 15. But next week, as you can see here, they're going to be taking on the Iowa State Buckeyes on the road. Definitely not an easy matchup. Then moving closer down, we've got Notre Dame, who had a huge game against Navy on the road at MetLife Stadium. A dominant win by the Fighting Irish. And I feel like at this point, it's safe to say that we can forget that NIU loss that the Irish had all those weeks ago. Primarily because if you look at the way A&M played against LSU, they dominated the Tigers, but they had a tough time at home against Notre Dame. I feel like that speaks volumes. And if we're going to talk about teams that are speaking volumes, let's talk about the Indiana Hoosiers. This team deserves way more respect. Currently on top of the Big Ten with just a runaway win against Washington, and the atmosphere from College Game Day was just great. The fans clearly care more about Hoosier football than they did a couple of years ago. The only problem now is an away game against Ohio State and even a home game against Michigan. It's definitely not a walk for Indiana, but there is still hope for them to remain undefeated. And speaking of teams remaining undefeated, Iowa State right there at the bottom for me of the top 10 still have an opportunity to really make dividends in the Big 12 and really kind of branch their way out into one of those top 4 spots in the college football playoff. But that is going to do it for time here on week 10 of the Hot Hierarchy. Thanks for tuning in, and we're going to send it over to Jake, who's talking about the Heisman.
Thanks, Will. Welcome to Heisman Watch, where we take a look at the NFL's future stars down at the college level and speculate which of the sport's best athletes will join a list of football royalty and take home the coveted Heisman Trophy. What a week of college football we had, ladies and gentlemen. I sat on the couch this weekend thinking my rankings were perfect and they would remain unchanged. Well, I was absolutely wrong about that, and everything kind of blew up. So let's take a look at this new batch of Heisman rankings I cooked up for this week's show. So we're going to start off at number 1 and work our way down to number 3, starting off with the Oregon quarterback, Dillon Gabriel. He won in a 38-9 game over Illinois, and it was an absolute blowout in a clinic put on by the best quarterback in the Big Ten. Yes, I said it as a Buckeye fan. The best quarterback in the Big Ten is from Oregon, and his name is Dillon Gabriel. Looking at the stats, he had 291 yards, 3 touchdowns, and a QB rating of 95.8. You know, we talked about last week that whenever Oregon had the ball, they felt like they were going to score. Same goes in this game, and Dillon Gabriel not only has proven to me that he is worthy to be in the Heisman rankings, but now he is at the top of the table. It's going to be a big game against Michigan in the Big House, big test for Oregon, so let's see what they can do this coming weekend. Secondly, we're going to go down to Cam Ward, who has fallen off from number 1 and is now at number 2. In a 36-14 win over Florida State, I honestly expected a better game out of Ward. With 208 yards, he had 0 touchdowns and a QB rating of 71.7, his first time this season out of the 90s. Also, you would think that he was great at rushing in past games, but in this game, he had -4 rushing yards. It was kind of concerning, in my opinion, to see him play like that. I'm not going to hit the panic button just yet, though. I still think he's worthy of being number 1 on my Heisman rankings, so we're going to see how he puts through in the next week. But returning to the Heisman Watch rankings, yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen, that is Travis Hunter. He appeared on my first batch of rankings but fell off after a shoulder injury, but he is back and he made a statement. So Travis Hunter had a great game against Cincinnati, winning 34-13, and he looked healthy. He had 9 carries worth 153 yards and 2 touchdowns. On the defensive side of the ball, he had 2 tackles and 4 pass breakups. Now, we started to put him on the back burner because he wasn't playing that good, and neither was the school to begin with, but he showed once again why he is a rarity in football, and we are going to see him coming at number 1 in the draft. He might even work his way back up to number 1 on the Heisman rankings. So there you have it, football fans. That's this week's edition of Heisman Watch. Thank you so much for watching. We're going to toss it back over to Kyle, and once again, my name is Jake Well. Thanks for watching.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another week of Sparrow's Sensational Fantasy Breakdown. And this week we have some rookies for you guys that really showed out this week. Speaking of rookies, we have Bo Nix, the quarterback for the Denver Broncos. After this week, he became the number 9 fantasy quarterback, and he had a really good week. He had 29.76 points against Carolina. Passed for 284 yards, and here's where you got your fantasy points once again. 3 touchdowns, and he also had just on 4 yards and 5 attempts rushing. He did have 1 touchdown. As I said last week and weeks before, Bo Nix is a really good out-of-the-pocket quarterback. He can scramble, he can improvise, and he's only a rookie. He's projected 18.6 points week 9 against a very, very tough Baltimore defense. We saw that. They limited Baker Mayfield, who was on fire in fantasy, and they just limited him. As I have here, tough matchup against Baltimore. But Bo Nix has a really high ceiling. I think the Denver Broncos are starting to really come into their rhythm. Although, going against that Baltimore defense, I do have him as a sit-em. But don't be surprised if in the later weeks he does a really good job of coming out of his shell. Moving on. I mean, this is a pivotal matchup this week. It was 49ers against Cowboys. We have Brock Purdy, who had a really good showing against this Dallas defense. He became the number 8 fantasy quarterback after week 8. He had 26 points against Dallas. Passing, he had 260 yards and a 1 touchdown. Rushing, he did rush for 8 attempts and 56 yards as well as a touchdown. He does have a bye this week, or this next week, but injuries. The 49ers are very injured. They lost Brandon Ayuk to a torn ACL for the rest of the year. As we all know, Christian McCaffrey is starting to come back into training, but he still is dealing with that Achilles problem, and they are down to possibly their 3rd string running back, as Mason is also listed as questionable with that AC joint sprain. But Brock Purdy, he's always been pretty good in fantasy. He throws for a lot of yards. He also still has George Kittle and Deebo Samuel, so look out in the next coming weeks after this bye week. And I had him on here last week. I have him on again here this week. Jalen Hurts, number 6 fantasy quarterback after this week 8 performance, and he showed out once again. He had 35.14 points against Cincinnati, 236 yards and 1 touchdown. But here's where you get your fantasy points. 10 attempts, 37 yards, and 3 touchdowns. We know that the Eagles love to do the tush push, and he is their primary target for that tush push, which is how he gets those 3 touchdowns. He's projected 23.9 points week 9 against the Jacksonville Jaguars. And I think he's going to eclipse 25 points once again. We are starting to see, and he is becoming the Jalen Hurts that we all know from last season. I have him as a stardom, obviously. In these past 2 weeks, he's gotten above 30 points, and he is starting to really become dangerous on his feet. Next, I talked about another rookie in this segment, and it's Marvin Harrison Jr., number 18 fantasy wide receiver after this Week 8 performance. 23.1 points against Miami. 6 receptions. He eclipsed 100 yards, had 111 yards, and a touchdown. He's projected 13 points Week 9 against Chicago, who had a very interesting game. Hail Mary W for the Commanders, and I mean against the Chicago defense, who is very stingy. So he's a hit-or-miss wide receiver. I think in these past 5 weeks, he has gotten 3 points, 0 points, but he's also had some really good games with 10-plus points. I have him as a sit-him, though, due to the stingy Chicago defense. Another one, this guy's been consistent all year long so far. Jamar Chase became the number 1 fantasy wide receiver after Week 8 against Philadelphia. He had 20.4 points against Philadelphia. He had 54 yards, 9 receptions, and a touchdown, and it's those receptions that are getting him those points, as well as that touchdown obviously accounts for 6 points of that. Projected 18.1 points Week 9 against the Raiders, and consistency, as I said before, he is consistently getting targeted a lot, as he is Joe Burrow's favorite target. But he's got a matchup against the Raiders. I have him as a stardom. Raiders defense is pretty banged up, so I would expect him to eclipse 20 points again. And then we talked about Brock Purdy, and then on the other side of the ball, we got CeeDee Lamb, number 4 fantasy wide receiver after Week 8, and it was a pivotal matchup, and he showed out. He got 39.6 points against San Francisco, 13 receptions for 146 yards and 2 touchdowns. It is clear that he is Dak Prescott's favorite target. He's projected 21.3 points against Atlanta, and he, as I said, he's the number 1 wide receiver in Dallas. He's having a really good season so far. I have him as an obvious stardom, CeeDee Lamb. He's very good at those deep routes. He can cut, he can juke, he can do everything. And next, another rookie, Keon Coleman, had a really good performance. I really like what I saw out of Keon Coleman. He became the number 36 fantasy wide receiver after Week 8. He had 18 points against Seattle, 5 receptions for 70 yards and a touchdown. And that touchdown was a beautiful touchdown against one of the best corners in football. Lost him, and it was a jump ball. And I have him as a stardom. Again, contested catches. His stock is only rising. He's projected 11.5 points against Miami. And Miami's kind of banged up as well on defense. And Keon Coleman's starting to rise in Josh Allen's favoritism in getting the ball. Moving on, this guy was here last week. He's here again this week. Cade Otton for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Number 6 fantasy tight end after Week 8. 29.1 points against Atlanta. And I said last week he's going to be Baker Mayfield's primary target due to those 2 injuries for Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. And 81 yards, 9 receptions, and 2 touchdowns should really tell you all the things that you need to know. Projected only 12.2 points against Kansas City in Week 9. He's a primary target for Baker. I have him as a sit-him, though, because the Kansas City defense, they are undefeated. They are the only undefeated team left in the NFL. I have him as a sit-him due to those 2 injuries, and I think they're going to focus more on Cade Otton due to how he's performing recently. And also, speaking of the Chiefs, we got Travis Kelce, who finally had a good game against the Las Vegas Raiders. Number 7 fantasy tight end after Week 8, 25 points against that Raiders defense, 10 receptions for 190 yards, and 1 touchdown. And we really got to see Patrick Mahomes and the Travis Kelce connection that we've seen pretty much throughout their entire career. Projected 13.5 points Week 9 against Tampa. If Travis Kelce can do what he does and get open, Patrick Mahomes there's no doubt in my mind Patrick Mahomes will find him, and he's back. Travis Kelce had a couple off weeks to start the season, but he's back. He's starting to score touchdowns. I have him as a stardom. against a Tampa Bay defense that is pretty good, but Travis Kelce is Travis Kelce, and he can just get open. And then probably one of the most consistent players that I've seen in fantasy recently, it's Kyren Williams, number 5 fantasy running back for the LA Rams, 22.6 points week 8 against Minnesota. And Rams exposed the Minnesota Vikings. Yes, they did get a favorable call with that face mask, but Kyren Williams has consistently been good both running and receiving wise. He had 23 carries for 97 yards, and he also had 19 yards on 5 receptions for a touchdown. He has consistently gotten over 15 points. In my opinion, if you have him on your team, there is no doubt in my mind he's a starter. He's projected 20.6 points against Seattle in Week 9, but he is one of the best running backs in the league, and we've seen it both receiving. He's always their power back when they get into the red zone and goal line situations, and he's averaging 19.9 points. He's almost averaging 20 points a game in fantasy. If you have him, there is no doubt in my mind you should start him. And another running back to round out this week's segment is going to be James Cook. Became the number 8 fantasy running back after Week 8, 28.3 points against Seattle. Bills were firing on all cylinders against that Seattle defense. 17 carries for 111 yards, 2 touchdowns. And that's really what we see out of James Cook. He kind of slices and dices through that defense, and he's able to juke past holes and find holes that we don't even see on the broadcast. He's projected 16.7 points Week 9 against Miami. There's no doubt in my mind he'll eclipse that. And consistency is key. He's been a consistent running back in fantasy, and his stock keeps rising. And he's a really good receiving back as well, as Josh Allen likes to put him on those corner routes out of the backfield. So there's no doubt in my mind he's a stardom. But yeah, that's all I have for you guys this week on Sparrow's Sensational Fantasy Breakdown, and we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you so much, Kyle, and thank you for such an informational week, and to also Jake and Will for such an informational week. You guys really killed it this week. Great job, everybody. But now it's time for the NFL breakdown with yours truly, Chris the Moose Johnson, and we're going to start it off with a brand new showcase of our NFL standings. So let's get right into it. We have, as you can see, every team ranked as where they're going to be right now. If the playoffs started right now, if the season ended, this is where they're all ranked at. They're going to have their record next to them and their number of where they're ranked in the NFL right next to them as well. So, as you can see, that's our top 16. And now here's our back 16 as we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the Niners, the Seahawks, the Rams, the Cowboys, Bengals, Dolphins, and Browns. But the back end teams really not doing too hot. Raiders at 25 with a 2-6 record. There's a lot of 2-6 teams out there, not too far away from getting in the playoffs if they need to be. A lot of teams can turn around their season still, but it's not looking too hot for a lot of these teams in the back end. But let's get right into our Eagles versus Bengals recaps, because we got to recap the games that happened last week, some of the more important and more flashy ones. We had a setting the narrative game, big-time game for both of these teams down in Cincinnati, and that is the Eagles going against them, and the Eagles won by a comfortable 20 points. That is right. The Eagles completely showed out who they were and who they're going to be this season, with a lot of rushing attack from Saquon Barkley and Jalen Hurts, and A.J. Brown over the top like I had predicted the week before. I told you this team had found their identity, and it's starting to show. The Bengals, however, are still stumbling, haven't really found their identity. Joe Burrow had a 1 touchdown, 1 interception game, while Jalen Hurts had a 4 touchdown to 0 interception game, or 0 turnover game, which, to popular belief, the Eagles really needed Jalen Hurts to stop turning the ball over. And a lot of the analysts out there and a lot of people out there are saying that he wasn't doing too hot this year with turning the ball over. Well, guess what? It stopped at 5, and this game might have propelled him into an MVP revive. That is right. Jalen Hurts might have finally gotten his team back into MVP status for himself as well. With a 5-2 record, he has over 1,544 yards, but if you do his total yardage, he's at 1,799 total yards. He only has 15 total touchdowns on the year, and he only has 5 turnovers. He had 0 turnovers last game, 3 rushing touchdowns, over 225 passing yards, and over 30 yards rushing. He's an elite player, And without him, the Eagles aren't the Eagles. That tush-push doesn't work. The passing game doesn't work. He knows how to keep the ball protected and keep it safe, especially in the Cincinnati game. And if he can keep it going this way the rest of the year, there's a good chance you see Jalen Hurts on an MVP ballot at the end of the year. Now, we're going to be moving into the Raiders game, as it wasn't that good of a game for the Raiders. It's a 27-20 game. Patrick Mahomes threw an interception. His year of struggling to keep the ball in his team's possession and not turn it over is still going on, as the Raiders didn't really turn the ball over. Even though that happened, they still couldn't get the job done. And it's obvious that it's the quarterback situation that's getting the Raiders where they're at right now. And that's why we're going to do a little bit of a throwback segment, and I'm going to tell you some things that could happen in the NFL draft for the Las Vegas Raiders. I know it's a little early, but it's never too early to look at possible scenarios for your team. As we can see right here, we got our QB possibilities with Cam Ward and Jackson Dart. Cam Ward is a Heisman favorite and continues to shine week in and week out. He has shown every facet of his career in his college life. Really, if you look at his stats, he has 16,000 career passing yards. He has over 160 total touchdowns and has 35 interceptions. Now, my scenario for the Raiders is they trade up to a top 3 draft pick, mainly probably 2 or maybe 1, and go draft Cam Ward. You need your quarterback. You need it bad. And this team's not far away. This team is literally a quarterback away. So if you get that, it could really turn the Raiders franchise around. And I think he's a franchise quarterback for whoever he falls to. And of course, the other side is another scenario, and my favorite scenario for the Raiders is Jackson Dart of Ole Miss. He is an absolute monster of a quarterback, and honestly, he's going to be falling to the second round. And I know people are going to be like, whoa, second round quarterback normally doesn't do too well. Well, guess what? Jalen Hurts is a second round quarterback, and the Eagles made it to the Super Bowl and are a contender because of him. And we just had a segment talking about him being an MVP. So why not go get a guy in the second round, especially if you can take a high overall talent like Ashton Johnson or Travis Hunter? This team is going to be dangerous if they decide to go this way in the draft. And the Raiders aren't far away from being a real contender in the AFC West. Don't forget that. Now we're going to be moving on to the Bears winning the game. Psych. Jaden Daniels throws an amazing pass at a Hail Mary to end the game and completely destroys the Bears and wins the first game against him and his going to be rival, Caleb Williams, because we're not going to stop talking about these two quarterbacks together for the entirety of their careers. And that's just the harsh truth of it. Jaden Daniels will be compared to Caleb Williams throughout their careers, and this is going to be one of those games that we're going to look back on and go, man, Jaden Daniels is a problem, and Caleb Williams couldn't find an answer. But good job to the Commanders this weekend, though, and what a game by the NFL to flex, to have more eyes on it. It was amazing to watch. Now we're going to be moving into the playoffs, as the AFC has changed a little bit. We have the Chiefs at 1, we have the Texans at 2, the Chargers at 7. The Ravens fell all the way to 6. They were at 3, but now they had to play the Steelers now, who now hold the AFC North in their hands. The Bills are at 4, and the Broncos are at 5. We have 3 AFC West teams in the playoffs, and it's a little shocking to me because the AFC West I didn't think was that good of a division this year, but still, there's 3 of them in the playoffs. And, of course, the people in the hunt, the Bengals, who just didn't help their chances this weekend against the Eagles, the Colts and the Dolphins. The Colts, with Anthony Richardson just subbing himself out, they could have been in the playoffs if they won a game, but they didn't. Instead, him subbing himself out and the Colts losing, massive fault right now, and it puts them out of the playoffs currently. And Tua, he came back, he looked good, the team looked good, but they just couldn't pull out the win against the Cardinals, and they just came back and won that game. That was an amazing game to watch as well. Kyler Murray showed out at the end. But now let's go over to the NFC. As the NFC, we have the Lions at number 1, the Commanders at 2, the Falcons at 3, the Cardinals at 4, the Packers at 5, the Vikings at 6, and the Eagles at 7. The Eagles just knocked the Bears out, especially with that Hail Mary. The Commanders help a division rival get into the playoffs, And honestly, I don't know if you want to face the Eagles in the playoffs as a 7th seed, especially if you're the Commanders as a young 2 seed. That's going to be a very, very scary game for them if that happens in the playoffs. The Packers take number 5, and they go up. The Lions stay as the NFC North champs right now, and the Vikings lost another game that I thought, shouldn't have lost. So it's going to be very interesting to see what's going to happen with them. The teams in the hunt, of course, the Niners are trying to make a clawback way. I don't know if the Cardinals are going to be able to hold on that long and keep the AFC West under their control. The Niners are a great team, and Christian McCaffrey's coming back this week, I believe. So be ready for that. And now we're going to be going on to the Moose versus the Machine segment. And that's right, we're going to be going and showing you what I'm going to be predicting versus what my Moose Stat's going to be predicting. And guess what? We're deadlocked again. This is right, we're deadlocked again. Another tie between me and my Moose Stat, as last week I didn't do too hot. I had quite a few losses as we had around, I believe it was 6 or 7 losses. I know I only had one less, I had one more than the Moose Stat, but I predicted a few good ones. Me and the Moose Stat went back and forth, had a few disagreements as it prevailed with the Commanders and the Broncos game. But we got to keep it going. So we're going to get into my predictions as the Texans, the Falcons, the Ravens, the Bills, the Saints, the Bears, the Titans, the Commanders, the Browns, the Bengals, the Eagles, the Lions, the Rams, the Vikings, and the Chiefs are all my picks this week. Hopefully they're going to be going good this week. I don't really have faith in a lot of teams. We'll go over the disagreements between me and the Moose Stat in a second. Now, here's are my Moose Stat predictions. As you can see, it changes a little bit. It's a little different, but hey, it's still our predictions. So let's see what's going to happen as we go into the Chargers versus the Browns. I think the Browns are going to be winning the game, as the Moose Stat thinks the Chargers are going to be winning the game. I think Jameis Winston really gives his team a electric boost they needed, and Nick Chubb is going to get into the end zone this weekend. I really feel it, even though the Chargers have a really good defense and their offense starting to find their groove. I think the Browns are going to pull out this win. Now, we're going to go into the Bears versus the Cardinals. I think the Bears are going to have a bounce back game. They're going to beat the Cardinals this week pretty convincingly, as I don't think the Cardinals are that good of a team. I just don't. I know they've been playing better than I think they will be, but I think the Bears are a better overall team, and that defense is ready to fire it up to get a respond game, especially against Kyler Murray and Marvin Harrison Jr. Then we have the Lions versus the Packers. I have the Lions winning this game, as the Lions are a complete juggernaut right now, and I don't think any team can really stop them. It could be the 7-0 Chiefs right now. It could be the Eagles. It could be the Bengals. It could be the Ravens. It could be anybody. They're not beating the Lions right now. The Lions are too good of a team, and the Packers are just young, and it's a division game. But hey, the Lions are a legit team. The Moose Stat disagrees with me, though, and says the Packers will be winning this game. Then I believe the LA Rams will be beating the Seattle Seahawks. Still no DK, I believe. The Rams have Puka and Cooper Kupp back, and the defense is firing on cylinders. Be ready to watch the Rams really step into gear as the Seahawks take a step back, and that's what I believe is going to be happening for that game, as that will be all for this week on the Moose Trail. I'm your host, Chris the Moose Johnson. Thank you to Jake, Will, and Kyle for such an amazing week, and we'll see you guys next week.